Imagine walking into a quiet library, a place meant for peace, reflection, and learning. Now picture that same space suddenly transformed into the scene of a chilling murder where the sound of turning pages was replaced by whispered confusion and the quiet hum of panic. In 1969, Betsy Ardsma walked into the Patty Library at Penn State University, never imagining it would be the last walk of her life. There were no screams, no calls for help. In a single, silent moment, she was brutally stabbed, and within minutes, her life was taken. What makes this case even more haunting is that, to this day, we don't know who did it. There were no confirmed suspects, no witnesses came forward. And as the years passed, the questions only grew louder. Who killed Betsy Ardsma? And why? In the next minutes, I'm going to take you deep into the heart of this unsolved mystery. We'll examine every clue, every piece of evidence, and try to unravel a case that has stumped investigators for over 5 decades. Brace yourselves, because this is a story of silence, secrets, and a murder that still echoes through the halls of Patty Library. Let's dive into the chilling mystery of the murder of Betsy Ardsma, a case that, even now, refuses to give up its secrets. Before we delve deeper into the mystery, we have to understand who Betsy Ardsma was, because her story didn't start with that tragic day in the library. Betsy Ruth Ardsma was 22 years old when she died, a bright young woman whose life was filled with promise. Born and raised in Holland, Michigan, she was known for her intellect, kindness, and unwavering dedication to her studies. Betsy wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was driven, curious, and had a clear vision for her future. She was enrolled as a graduate student at Penn State University, pursuing her master's degree in English, and at the time of her death, she had been working diligently on a project that she hoped would shape her academic career. Her academic achievements were only part of what made Betsy stand out. She was also deeply compassionate, involved in volunteering, and always looking for ways to make the world a better place. Friends described her as gentle but determined, someone who carried a quiet strength. She had a sharp mind, a love for literature, and a passion for the future she was building. To her, education was the key to unlocking the life she wanted, a life that was brutally taken from her far too soon. Betsy wasn't just a student, she was a daughter, a sister, and a girlfriend. She had dreams of settling down with her boyfriend, David Wright, a medical student at Penn State with whom she had a serious and committed relationship. They were planning for the future together, plans that would never come to fruition. She had only been at Penn State for a few months before her life was tragically cut short. Her death was not only a loss for those who knew her, but it also robbed the world of the impact she could have made. Betsy's murder wasn't just the violent end of a life. It was the shattering of potential, ambition, and love. Her death wasn't just a statistic in a police report. It was the heartbreaking loss of a young woman whose life was full of promise and hope. As we move forward, remember that Betsy wasn't just the victim of a senseless crime. She was a vibrant, intelligent, and driven individual who had everything to live for. Her story, her future, was stolen that day in the library. And the most disturbing part? We still don't know who took it from her. It was November 28th, 1969, the day after Thanksgiving. For most people, it was a quiet time, a chance to relax before the end of the semester. But for Betsy Ardsma, it was another day focused on her studies. Like any determined graduate student, Betsy had work to do, and she spent that day preparing for an upcoming paper she was writing for one of her English classes. Nothing about the day stood out as unusual, at least not at first. Betsy had been staying with friends in nearby Harrisburg over the holiday break, but by that Friday, she was back on campus, ready to get back into her academic routine. That afternoon, she met up with her roommate, Sharon, and the two of them decided to head to the Patty Library to study. The library was a familiar and comfortable space for Betsy, a place she'd been to many times before, where the atmosphere was always calm and focused. The day itself was unremarkable in its normalcy. Betsy and Sharon entered the library around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, planning to spend a couple of hours studying before Betsy had plans to meet up with her boyfriend, David Wright, later that evening. The couple had been dating for some time, and Betsy often looked forward to their time together, a welcome break from the pressures of academic life. The two friends split up once inside the library. Sharon went off to another section while Betsy headed to the basement level of the stacks, an area filled with bookshelves that formed a maze of knowledge, quiet and isolated, a perfect spot to focus. She planned to gather some research materials for her paper and spend a little more time reviewing them before calling it a day. It's crucial to understand just how ordinary this day was for Betsy. There were no warning signs, no sense of danger lurking around the corner. To anyone observing her, it was just another Friday afternoon at Penn State, students coming and going, absorbed in their own worlds. But somewhere in those library stacks, something far more sinister was about to unfold. By the time Betsy's roommate realized something was wrong, it was already too late. Betsy's plans for the evening would never be fulfilled. Instead, what had started as a typical day would end in a tragedy that would send shockwaves through the campus and leave a trail of unanswered questions for decades to come. The events leading up to Betsy's death were so mundane, so routine, that it's difficult to comprehend how things could take such a horrific turn. But as we'll see, in the quietest of moments, the most terrible crimes can occur. At some point between 4 and 5 o'clock on that cold November afternoon, the ordinary day took a sudden, violent turn. Betsy Ardsma was deep in the quiet isolation of the library stacks, buried in her research. The basement level of the Paddy Library was a labyrinth of shelves, its narrow aisles cloaked in silence, the kind of place where sound hardly travels and distractions are few. But in those moments, something unspeakable happened. Without warning, someone approached Betsy and, in a single, swift motion, stabbed her in the chest. The attack was brutal but precise. The killer's weapon, likely a small, sharp blade, pierced Betsy's heart with one clean strike. There was no hesitation, no sign of a struggle. It was as though the attacker knew exactly what they were doing. One quick stab, and the damage was fatal. What makes this moment even more chilling is the silence that surrounded it. No one heard Betsy scream. In fact, no one nearby seemed to notice anything out of the ordinary. The Patty Library wasn't empty, students were scattered throughout the stacks, and people were coming and going. Yet, in this crowded space, the attack went completely unnoticed. In those seconds after the stabbing, Betsy managed to stand, perhaps in shock or confusion, but only briefly. She collapsed to the floor between the rows of books. A few moments later, two students passing by saw her on the ground. At first, they thought she had simply fainted. There was no visible blood, no obvious signs of an assault. In the dim light of the stacks, the scene looked more like a medical emergency than a crime. The students quickly alerted the library staff and help was summoned. Paramedics arrived, still under the assumption that Betsy had collapsed due to some sudden illness or a fainting spell. It wasn't until they moved her that they realized the gravity of the situation. Beneath her blouse, they found the single stab wound, a wound so precise that it had caused her heart to fill with blood, obscuring any initial signs of trauma. By the time anyone realized what had truly happened, it was far too late. Betsy Ardsma was already gone, her life extinguished by a single, calculated act of violence. The silence of the library, the very place she had sought for study and peace, had become the perfect cover for her murderer. What followed in the minutes and hours after the attack was confusion. No one had seen the killer. No one had heard a thing. In the midst of one of the busiest libraries on campus, a young woman had been murdered in cold blood, and somehow no one knew who had done it or why. When Betsy Ardsma collapsed between the towering bookshelves of the Patty Library, it wasn't immediately clear that something terrible had occurred. The scene was almost surreal, a young woman, motionless on the floor, as if she had fainted from exhaustion or a sudden illness. A couple of students passing by noticed her lying there, her body slumped awkwardly in the narrow aisle. Their first instinct, like anyone's, was to assume she needed medical attention. In a panic, they rushed to get help. The library was busy enough that it didn't take long for a small group to gather a few students, a librarian, all of them unsure of what had just happened. To them, it seemed like a medical emergency, and in the confusion of the moment, no one suspected that a violent crime had taken place right in front of them. There was no visible blood, no cries for help. It was as though Betsy had simply collapsed, her body betraying her for some unknown reason. Among the gathering crowd, people did their best to help. Someone checked for a pulse. Another student ran to find a librarian, hoping they could call for proper medical assistance. It wasn't chaos, but rather a hurried sense of concern, an attempt to assist what they thought was a fellow student in distress. Betsy's skin had already begun to pale, her breathing shallow. Time was slipping away, and no one knew just how grave the situation truly was. Minutes passed, and paramedics finally arrived. Still under the impression that Betsy had fainted, they began working to revive her. They checked her vitals, searching for any signs of life. And then, in the act of moving her, they noticed something unexpected, a small but telling wound on her chest. It was the kind of wound that could have easily been missed under normal circumstances, but as they examined her closer, they realized the horrible truth. This was no fainting spell. Betsy had been stabbed. The realization sent a shockwave through those present. What they thought was a simple medical emergency was suddenly something far darker, a murder carried out in the most silent, calculated manner. The precision of the stab wound, the lack of immediate blood, had disguised the gravity of the situation. And by the time anyone understood what had happened, it was too late. Betsy Ardsma was already dead. The paramedics tried to save her, but the single stab wound had done its fatal work. The blade had punctured her heart, causing internal bleeding that had rapidly drained her life away. What began as an attempt to help a fallen student had turned into the discovery of a crime so quiet, so unexpected that it left everyone in disbelief. As Betsy's body was taken away, the library was left in a stunned silence. How could something like this happen unnoticed in such a public place? The discovery of Betsy's body marked the beginning of a long and frustrating investigation, one that would ultimately leave more questions than answers. The discovery that Betsy Artsma had been murdered set off a flurry of activity at Penn State University, with the initial shock quickly giving way to the urgent need for answers. Once paramedics realized that this was not a medical emergency but a cold-blooded murder, the police were immediately called in. The Patty Library, once a quiet haven for study, was suddenly transformed into a crime scene. Police quickly cordoned off the area, isolating the basement stacks where Betsy had been found. Investigators moved fast, but they were already working at a disadvantage. The delay in recognizing that a murder had taken place meant that precious time had been lost. In those critical moments before the area was sealed off, the crime scene had been disturbed not just by the paramedics and concerned students who had tried to help Betsy, but also by the normal library traffic. Dozens of people had been coming and going, completely unaware that a crime had been committed. This was a major setback. As officers began their search for clues, the challenges quickly piled up. In a scene as public and chaotic as a university library, the potential for evidence contamination was high. Students had been wandering through the aisles, unknowingly stepping near or even on the very spot where Betsy had been attacked. Footprints, fingerprints, fibers, any trace of the killer could have been compromised in those early moments. The fact that the weapon had not been found only added to the difficulty. Police scoured the stacks for anything that might point them in the direction of the attacker. They searched for the murder weapon, interviewing anyone who had been in the library that afternoon, but leads were sparse. No one had seen the actual attack. No one had heard a scream. And because Betsy's death had been misinterpreted as a medical incident at first, the police had arrived after vital minutes had already passed. Every second counted in a murder investigation, and too many had slipped away before they could properly secure the scene. The investigation was further hampered by the sheer size and complexity of the Patty Library itself. It was a sprawling building full of narrow, winding aisles that offered countless hiding places and exit routes. The basement stacks where the murder occurred were particularly dense with bookshelves, casting deep shadows in the dimly lit space. It was an environment that made it easy for someone to slip in and out unnoticed. Even more frustrating, the crime had occurred during the busy afternoon hours, with students studying in various corners of the library. The chances of isolating the killer among such a crowd were slim. Despite these difficulties, the police pressed forward, determined to find answers. They began interviewing students and staff who had been in the library at the time, hoping someone might have noticed anything that could point them in the right direction. But the more they dug, the clearer it became. Whoever had killed Betsy had done so in a manner that left virtually no trace. It was as if the killer had vanished into thin air. The delay in recognizing the gravity of the situation had cost them. Crucial evidence may have been lost, and the killer was likely long gone by the time the police arrived. Yet, even with these early setbacks, investigators were determined not to let Betsy's murder go unsolved. They would search every corner, ask every question, and chase down every lead, no matter how thin. But in those first hours, as they scoured the library and questioned witnesses, one troubling thought hung over the entire investigation. How could someone commit such a violent act in the middle of a public space in broad daylight and disappear without a trace? It was a question that would haunt the case for decades to come. As the investigation into Betsy Artsma's murder continued, the search for forensic evidence became a top priority. Yet, from the very beginning, it was clear that this would be no ordinary case. The crime had been carried out with such precision and stealth that investigators were left with very little to work with. Forensic science in the late 1960s was not as advanced as it is today, but even by those standards, the lack of physical evidence was troubling. One of the most significant issues was the missing murder weapon. Despite an extensive search of the library and surrounding areas, the weapon used to kill Betsy was never found. Police believed that the attacker must have used a sharp, narrow blade, most likely a knife of some kind, to deliver a single, fatal stab wound to her chest. The wound had punctured her heart with deadly accuracy, killing her within minutes. But with no weapon in hand, detectives could only speculate about its size and shape, leaving them without a crucial piece of evidence to tie to any potential suspect. Adding to the mystery, there were no signs of a struggle at the scene. Betsy hadn't fought back, and no defensive wounds were found on her body. This detail led investigators to believe that the attack was swift, catching her completely off guard. It was as if the killer had known exactly what they were doing, approaching her with such speed and precision that she never had a chance to react. The fact that no one heard any screams or cries for help in the otherwise quiet library stacks only deepened the sense that the murder had been meticulously planned and executed. The stab wound itself became a focal point for forensic experts. It was clean and precise, striking directly at her heart, leaving little doubt that the killer had intended to end her life with a single blow. This level of precision led to speculation about the attacker's background. Could they have been someone with medical or anatomical knowledge? Was this a random act of violence, or did the killer know exactly where to strike to ensure that Betsy would not survive? Despite their best efforts, investigators found themselves at a standstill when it came to forensic evidence. There were no clear fingerprints, no traces of blood left by the killer, no fibers or hairs that could be linked to a suspect. In the busy library, any potential clues may have been trampled or obscured by the countless students and staff who had moved through the area in the hours following the murder. The scene had been contaminated before the police even knew what they were dealing with. This lack of evidence led to frustration on all sides. The police were desperate for any lead, but the forensic trail was practically non existent. The only solid clue they had was the nature of the wound itself, a single fatal strike that suggested both skill and intent. The fact that the killer had managed to commit such a violent act without leaving behind any substantial evidence only added to the mystery. It was as if the crime had been carried out by someone who knew exactly how to evade detection. As the forensic team continued to analyze what little they had, one thing became clear. This was not an ordinary murder. Whoever had killed Betsy Ardsma had done so in a way that defied easy explanation. The lack of physical evidence, combined with the killer's ability to disappear without a trace, left investigators with more questions than answers. And with no forensic trail to follow, they were left to rely on witness testimony and theories, none of which could fill the gaping hole left by the absence of hard evidence. The lack of forensic clues was a devastating blow to the investigation. In a case where every detail mattered, the killer had managed to leave behind almost nothing. And as weeks turned into months, the hope of finding that missing piece of evidence, the clue that could unlock the mystery, began to fade. But despite the challenges, investigators refused to give up. They knew that somewhere, hidden in the shadows of the library stacks or buried in the memories of those who had been there that day, the answer was waiting to be found. The Patty Library at Penn State University was far more than just a backdrop to Betsy Ardsma's murder. It played a central role in shaping the nature of the crime itself. On any given day, the library was a bustling hub of activity, packed with students studying for exams, researching papers, or simply escaping the outside world for a few hours. It was an academic sanctuary, a place of quiet where the only sounds were the faint shuffling of books and the soft footsteps echoing through its aisles. But in the context of Betsy's murder, the library also became a labyrinth, one that both obscured the crime and offered the killer a quick escape. The basement stacks where Betsy was attacked were particularly isolated and shadowed, a maze of narrow rows packed with bookshelves. This section of the library was less frequented than the more open reading areas, making it the perfect place for someone to move about largely unnoticed. In such a quiet space, students were often lost in their own world of study, focused more on their work than on their surroundings. This environment may have worked in the killer's favor, as it allowed them to approach Betsy undetected and to flee just as easily. Yet the library's busyness also posed a significant challenge for investigators. Students were constantly coming and going, and by the time anyone realized the crime had been committed, the number of potential witnesses had ballooned. The chaotic nature of the scene meant that dozens of people had unknowingly passed through the area around the time of the murder. Any of them could have brushed past the killer or worse, contaminated potential evidence, but no one had noticed anything suspicious. This constant flow of people complicated the search for the suspect, as it became nearly impossible to track who had been in the stacks at the precise moment of the murder. Adding to the complexity was the fact that Betsy was attacked during one of the busier times of the day, early evening, when students were gathering in the library to study after the Thanksgiving break. This raised an unsettling question: was the location chosen at random, or did the killer know Betsy would be there? Several theories emerged. One possibility was that Betsy's killer had specifically targeted her and knew her study habits, perhaps even knowing that she frequented the Patty Library. If this were the case, the crime could have been premeditated, with the killer selecting the library stacks as the ideal place to strike because of its isolation within the busy building. This would suggest a level of planning and forethought, a deliberate choice of location based on the knowledge that the library provided both cover for the attack and an easy way to blend in with the crowd afterward. Another theory suggested that the library itself was chosen simply because it offered the killer anonymity. The Patty Library was full of students, many of whom didn't know each other, making it easy for someone to blend in without arousing suspicion. In this theory, the attack may have been more opportunistic. The killer struck because they knew they could disappear into the constant ebb and flow of students without being noticed. And then there's the chilling possibility that the location was both random and intentional. The library, as a center of academia, could have been symbolic. Perhaps the killer harbored resentment toward the university or its students, seeing the library as a place where that frustration could be unleashed. In this scenario, Betsy's death might have been a horrifying case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, her life cut short not because of who she was, but because of where she happened to be. No matter the motive or reasoning behind the choice of the library, one thing was clear. The building itself played a crucial role in the crime. It provided the killer with an environment that allowed them to attack and escape swiftly, all within the cover of the library's quiet, labyrinthine nature. In those narrow stacks, surrounded by countless books, Betsy's life was stolen in a place where no one would have expected such violence to occur. And the busyness of the library, with its constant stream of students, made identifying the killer all the more difficult, turning what should have been a straightforward investigation into a frustrating, tangled web of unanswered questions. As investigators pored over the case, the significance of the library couldn't be ignored. Had the killer used the chaotic yet quiet space to their advantage, or was the library simply a convenient setting? Whatever the reason, the Patty Library remains inextricably linked to the unsolved mystery of Betsy Ardsma's murder, a place that had served as a refuge for learning, but now holds the lingering shadow of a violent, unthinkable act. One of the most perplexing aspects of Betsy Ardsma's murder is the absence of solid eyewitnesses. In a bustling university library filled with students and staff, you'd expect someone to have seen something, even if just a fleeting glance. But despite the crowded setting, no one could definitively say they saw the attack happen. Instead, investigators were left with scattered reports, vague descriptions, and one particularly puzzling lead: two men who were seen leaving the library shortly after the murder. These two men remain central to the mystery surrounding Betsy's death. Multiple witnesses recalled seeing them quickly exiting the library around the time of the murder, their behavior described as hurried, almost nervous. Some claimed the men looked out of place, while others barely took notice of them at all. What made their sudden departure suspicious was the timing. It was just minutes after Betsy was stabbed. Unfortunately, no one got a clear look at their faces, and their identities have never been confirmed. The descriptions of these men were vague at best. They were said to be young, possibly students, but with so many people entering and leaving the library at any given moment, these details were far from definitive. The fact that no one remembered anything more specific about them, no distinguishing features, no particular conversation or behavior, frustrated investigators. Were they simply two innocent students who happened to leave the library at the wrong time, or were they involved in something much more sinister? Despite extensive efforts to track them down, the men were never identified, leaving a gaping hole in the investigation. Had these two individuals seen something? Or worse, were they directly involved in Betsy's murder? The lack of clear answers only deepened the mystery. Their hurried exit raised countless questions, but without knowing who they were or why they left so suddenly, their connection to the crime remains speculative at best. Equally baffling was the eerie silence surrounding the attack. Betsy was stabbed in a quiet library where even the rustle of paper or the click of a pen would be heard. Yet no one reported hearing a scream, a struggle, or even a whisper of the violence that had just unfolded. The attack was swift, clean, and silent, so much so that even students studying nearby were oblivious to the horror happening just steps away. This silence has led to endless speculation. How could someone approach Betsy, stab her, and flee without a single noise breaking through the calm of the library? One theory suggests that the killer may have known Betsy, allowing them to get close enough without raising her alarm. Another possibility is that the attack was so sudden and precise that she didn't have time to scream or react. Investigators also considered whether the killer deliberately chose the basement stacks because of their isolated, quiet nature. The stacks were enclosed by rows of books, forming a labyrinthine area that muffled sound and obscured vision. In a space like this, someone could approach unnoticed, commit the crime, and disappear into the crowd of students without drawing attention. The very layout of the library worked in the killer's favor, providing a cover of silence that hid the violence. But perhaps the most chilling aspect is this: if no one heard anything, it suggests a level of control and calculation. The killer didn't just commit a random act of violence, they knew how to strike and vanish without a trace, leaving behind nothing but a silent scene and a trail of questions. The fact that no one heard or saw what really happened makes this crime all the more disturbing. The mystery of the two men and the quiet nature of the attack remain key elements in this unsolved case. Were these men just bystanders, or were they somehow involved in the murder? Why did no one hear any noises during the fatal attack? As investigators dug deeper, they realized that in a library full of people, silence can be both an accomplice and an enemy, keeping secrets that might never be revealed. As the investigation into Betsy Ardsma's death continued, one of the most crucial pieces of information came from the medical report. The autopsy revealed chilling details about the nature of her death, adding yet another layer of mystery to an already perplexing case. What the medical examiner found left little doubt about the intent behind the attack. Betsy's death had been swift and brutal, a single blow delivered with deadly precision. The autopsy confirmed that Betsy had died from a single stab wound to the chest. The blade had pierced her left breast and punctured her heart, causing her to bleed internally. What made this injury particularly significant was the precision with which it was inflicted. The wound had been clean and direct, striking at exactly the right spot to cause almost immediate death. Within minutes, Betsy's heart had filled with blood and she collapsed in the library aisle, her life slipping away before anyone even realized what had happened. The fact that the killer had delivered only one stab wound and that it was so perfectly placed led investigators to a disturbing conclusion. This was not the work of someone acting on impulse. This was calculated. The killer had known exactly where to strike, ensuring that Betsy wouldn't have time to fight back or scream. It was an attack that required knowledge of the human body and a certain level of control, suggesting that the killer may have been someone with medical or anatomical experience. The precision of the wound raised unsettling questions about whether this was a random act of violence or something far more premeditated. Another significant finding was the absence of any signs of sexual assault. Given the often violent nature of such crimes against women, investigators had to consider whether the attack had been sexually motivated. However, the autopsy revealed that there were no indications of a sexual assault or any other form of physical struggle. This only deepened the mystery. If this wasn't an attack driven by sexual violence or theft, then what was the motive? The medical report painted a picture of a crime that was both intimate and distant at the same time. The act of stabbing someone, especially with such precision, suggested a certain closeness between the attacker and the victim, yet the absence of a struggle, the lack of any personal violation, made the act seem detached, almost clinical. The killer had approached Betsy in the quiet isolation of the library stacks, struck her with a single fatal blow, and vanished without a sound. There was no lingering, no hesitation, just a clean, efficient execution. The precision of the wound also raised questions about whether the killer had done this before. Was this the work of someone experienced in inflicting harm, possibly with a background in medicine or anatomy? Or had the killer simply been fortunate in choosing a spot that would guarantee a quick death? These were questions that haunted investigators, but with no weapon and no clear suspect, they were left to speculate. Betsy's death was not the result of a frenzied, uncontrolled attack. It was deliberate, calculated, and in its own way methodical. The autopsy findings underscored this disturbing reality. Whoever had killed Betsy Ardsma knew how to do it quickly and without drawing attention to themselves, which only served to make the investigation that much harder. As investigators studied the medical report, they were left with more questions than answers. If the killer had not been driven by sexual motives or theft, then what had compelled them to take Betsy's life in such a calculated way? The medical report offered a glimpse into the mind of the killer, a person capable of deadly precision, but it couldn't explain why. And without understanding the why, investigators were left in the dark, grappling with a crime that seemed as cold and silent as the library where it had taken place. As the investigation deepened, the question that haunted everyone involved was, quite simply, why? Why had Betsy Artsma, a bright, promising student with no known enemies, been murdered in such a brutal yet calculated way? Was this an act of senseless violence, or was there something more personal behind her death? The lack of a clear motive became a central puzzle in this case, driving various theories that ranged from random chance to chillingly intentional. One of the earliest theories investigators considered was that Betsy had been the victim of a random act of violence. The notion that she had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time seemed plausible given the public nature of the crime scene. Libraries are open spaces where students come and go, and it was entirely possible that the killer had chosen the Patty Library as the perfect hunting ground, knowing they could blend into the crowd and disappear without a trace. In this scenario, the murder could have been a crime of opportunity, an unprovoked attack on an unsuspecting victim who happened to cross paths with the wrong person. But this theory, while possible, had its limitations. The precision of the stab wound, the absence of a struggle, and the killer's ability to strike and vanish without being noticed suggested a level of control that didn't fit the profile of a random, impulsive act. This led investigators to explore a more unsettling possibility that Betsy's murder had been premeditated and that she was specifically targeted. Could someone have known Betsy's routine? The fact that she had gone to the library with her roommate that day seemed ordinary enough, but was it possible that someone had been watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike? Betsy's life was, by all accounts, a happy and fulfilling one, but she was also deeply focused on her studies and had been involved in several social circles on campus. Investigators combed through her personal life, looking for anyone who might have harbored a grudge or had reason to harm her, but they found little evidence to suggest that Betsy had been entangled in any personal conflict that would lead to murder. Still, some believed the attack might have been personal. The single, deliberate stab wound seemed too precise, too intimate to be the work of a stranger. The lack of a sexual assault or theft further complicated the picture. If this wasn't a random act of violence or a crime of passion, then what was it? The idea that Betsy had been targeted specifically, whether by someone she knew or by a stranger who had fixated on her, could not be ruled out. In this scenario, the killer might have been someone who had studied her movements, knowing that the isolated basement stacks of the library would provide the perfect setting for a swift, silent attack. There was also the possibility that the attack wasn't meant for Betsy at all. Some speculated that the killer might have been seeking another victim and that Betsy had been mistaken for someone else. This theory, while more abstract, fit with the idea that the murder could have been premeditated but misdirected. However, without any concrete evidence to support it, this line of thinking remained largely speculative. Another theory floated early in the investigation was that Betsy's murder could have been the work of a disturbed individual with no clear motive other than the desire to kill. Serial killers, or those with violent psychological tendencies, sometimes attack without a specific target, their actions driven by a compulsion rather than personal animosity. The calculated nature of the crime, especially the precision of the wound, lent some credence to the idea that the killer might have been a sociopath or someone with experience in taking life, perhaps even someone familiar with anatomy or medicine. Yet, without any similar crimes in the area or a clear profile, this theory remained unsettlingly vague. As investigators sifted through these various possibilities, they found themselves frustrated by the lack of any strong leads. The question of motive was crucial because understanding why Betsy was killed could unlock the key to finding her murderer. But with no obvious personal conflicts, no clear indication of random violence, and a calculated, clean attack, the motives remained as elusive as the killer. The randomness of her location, isolated yet in a busy public space, only deepened the confusion. Was Betsy Ardsma murdered because of something she knew? Was she in the wrong place at the wrong time, a victim of a deranged mind seeking an outlet for violence? Or was she the target of someone who had carefully planned her death, waiting for just the right moment to strike? These questions lingered long after the initial investigation, with each theory pointing in a different direction, but none offering a definitive answer. In the end, the motive behind Betsy's murder remains one of the most troubling aspects of the case. Without understanding why this crime happened, it's impossible to fully comprehend how or who could have committed such a cold, calculated act. And as the case grew colder, the question of motive only became more haunting, an unanswered riddle in a story filled with dark, hidden truths. As the years passed, the case of Betsy Artsma's murder continued to confound investigators, and various theories and suspects emerged, each one offering a potential answer, yet none leading to a definitive conclusion. With no solid forensic evidence and only vague witness accounts to go on, the investigation became a web of speculation, rumors, and dead ends. Over time, several key theories gained traction, but each ultimately left both the authorities and the public frustrated. One of the most compelling early theories revolved around the idea that the killer could have been a student at Penn State. The library was a central hub for students, particularly those working on research or preparing for exams. Given that Betsy herself was a graduate student, it wasn't far-fetched to imagine that her killer could have been someone from the university community. Investigators looked into students who might have known Betsy or had a reason to target her, but no clear connections emerged. Her personal life seemed relatively conflict free, and there were no reports of any ongoing feuds or issues with classmates. Another theory suggested that the killer might have been a disturbed individual, a student or faculty member who had a history of mental health issues or erratic behavior. This line of thinking led police to explore the possibility that Betsy's murder could have been the work of someone who harbored hidden violent tendencies. Over the years, several students and staff were briefly considered as potential suspects based on this theory, but none were ever definitively linked to the crime. One name that repeatedly surfaced in this regard was Richard Hefner, a geology graduate student at Penn State who had a troubled reputation. Known for his temper and erratic behavior, Hefner was a familiar face around campus, and there were rumors that he had a history of problematic interactions with women. While he was briefly considered a person of interest, there was never any solid evidence connecting him to the crime. Although his behavior raised eyebrows, nothing concrete emerged to place him in the library at the time of the murder, and investigators were unable to pursue him further as a serious suspect. Another theory explored the possibility of a faculty member being involved. Professors, too, had access to the library, and some investigators speculated that the precision of the attack could point to someone with knowledge of anatomy or even medical training. The idea that a professor or faculty member could have harbored some dark secret was considered, but much like the student theory, this lead also went cold. No professor or staff member stood out as a likely suspect, and once again, the lack of concrete evidence made it impossible to build a strong case. Perhaps the most unsettling theory, however, was the possibility that Betsy had been killed by a complete stranger, an outsider who had no direct connection to her or the university. The idea that someone could have wandered into the library, committed the murder, and then slipped away unnoticed was deeply troubling, but it couldn't be ruled out. If the killer was a random person with no ties to Penn State, it would explain why no one at the university could be definitively linked to the crime. This theory led police to widen their search to include transient individuals or people passing through the area. However, no leads in this direction ever panned out, and the randomness of such a scenario made it nearly impossible to pursue. Another theory that gained some traction over the years was that the killer might have been someone with a history of violence or criminal behavior, but not necessarily a student or faculty member. This led to investigations into known criminals in the area, particularly those who had been involved in violent crimes or had a history of mental instability. However, none of these individuals matched the profile of someone who could have committed such a precise and clean murder, and once again, investigators found themselves at a dead end. The frustrating thing about each of these theories is that, while they all seemed plausible at different points in the investigation, none ever yielded the evidence needed to crack the case. Suspects came and went, but no one ever emerged as the definitive answer to the mystery. Investigators followed every lead they could find, but without hard evidence, each suspect eventually faded into the background. For the public, the lack of progress was exasperating. Over the years, the case took on a kind of mythic quality, an unsolved mystery that seemed to resist every attempt to find closure. Betsy's family, her friends, and the Penn State community were left with more questions than answers, as each theory that emerged only served to deepen the mystery rather than solve it. The fact that no suspect was ever definitively identified remains one of the most troubling aspects of Betsy Ardsma's murder. Whoever killed her had managed to slip through the cracks of the investigation, leaving no trail behind. Whether it was a deranged student, a disturbed faculty member, or a random outsider, the killer has remained an enigma, their identity forever hidden in the shadows of the Patty Library. As the years passed and leads dried up, the investigation grew colder, and the theories, while compelling, began to feel like echoes in an empty room. The killer, whoever they were, had vanished without a trace, leaving behind a crime that still haunts those who have tried and failed to solve it. In the months following Betsy Ardsma's murder, as leads grew colder and frustration mounted, a glimmer of hope arrived for investigators in the form of a letter. It was 1970, nearly a year after Betsy's death, and the case had stalled. Then, out of nowhere, a letter was delivered to authorities, seemingly providing the breakthrough they had been desperately seeking. The letter, written in a strange, cryptic tone, claimed responsibility for the murder and provided details that suggested the author knew more about the crime than the general public. For a brief moment, it seemed like the case might finally be solved. The letter was brief but chilling. The anonymous writer alluded to knowing intimate details about the crime, suggesting that they had been present at the library on the day of the murder. The letter described the location and timing of the attack in a way that felt credible, and it hinted at motives that left investigators intrigued. Though the specifics were vague, the tone of the letter conveyed a sinister, almost taunting message. The writer was suggesting they had gotten away with murder, and now they were offering just enough information to stir the pot, but not enough to reveal their identity. When the letter was first received, it injected a surge of energy into the stalled investigation. Investigators scrambled to analyze the writing, hoping that they had finally uncovered a lead that could bring them closer to Betsy's killer. Was this the confession they had been waiting for? The details seemed accurate enough to warrant serious consideration. The idea that the killer might be toying with the authorities, sending this letter to mock them, only made the pursuit of the author more urgent. For the first time in months, there was a sense of forward momentum. The public, too, was intrigued by the news of the letter. Betsy's murder had attracted national attention, and the thought that the killer might have come forward, even in a cryptic way, was enough to revive interest in the case. Newspapers ran stories about the letter, speculating on what it could mean and whether this new development would finally lead to the arrest of the person responsible for Betsy's death. For a brief moment, it felt like the investigation had turned a corner. But that hope was short lived. As investigators dug deeper into the contents of the letter, they began to realize that something was off. The details, while initially compelling, were not as specific as they first appeared. Some of the information in the letter could easily have been pieced together from public reports on the case. The more they examined it, the more it seemed like the letter was nothing more than a hoax, a cruel trick played by someone seeking attention, rather than the killer revealing themselves. It became clear that the letter's author had likely constructed their claims based on information that was already available in the media. While the timing of the letter and its tone had initially given it a sense of authenticity, there was nothing within it that investigators could use to move the case forward. It was a red herring meant to distract and confuse rather than solve the mystery. The realization that the letter was a hoax dealt a harsh blow to the investigation. Not only had the authorities wasted valuable time and resources chasing down the false lead, but it also took an emotional toll on those closest to the case. For Betsy's family and friends, the letter had offered a glimmer of hope that answers might finally be within reach, only for that hope to be cruelly dashed. False leads like this can derail investigations in profound ways. Every moment spent pursuing a hoax is a moment lost in the pursuit of real evidence. In a case like Betsy's, where leads were already scarce, the distraction caused by the letter delayed the investigation even further, adding to the growing sense of frustration and helplessness. Hoaxes like these also chip away at the morale of those working on the case, as well as the public's faith in the investigation. The letter was not the first, nor would it be the last, false lead in the investigation into Betsy Ardsma's murder, but it stands out as one of the most frustrating. At a time when the investigation was struggling to gain traction, the letter briefly reignited hope, only to dash it once again. It served as a painful reminder that, in the world of unsolved cases, not every clue is what it seems, and sometimes the greatest challenges come not from a lack of evidence, but from distractions that lead investigators down the wrong path. As the letter was ultimately dismissed as a hoax, the investigation returned to square one, with no closer understanding of who had killed Betsy or why. The promise of the letter had faded, leaving behind only the bitter taste of wasted time and dashed hope. But the investigation pressed on, determined to find the real answers, no matter how elusive they seemed to be. When news of Betsy Ardsma's murder first broke, it sent shockwaves through the Penn State community and beyond. A murder on a college campus, particularly one as quiet and sudden as this, was the kind of story that captured headlines. Yet, despite the initial media frenzy, Betsy's case never quite gained the lasting attention that some other unsolved murders of the time did. The question remains, why did the murder of a bright, young student fail to become a focal point for national media in the long term? At first, the media coverage was intense. Local and regional newspapers were quick to report on the grisly nature of the crime, with headlines describing the shocking attack in the library. The chilling fact that the murder had occurred in broad daylight, in the middle of a crowded public space, naturally drew attention. Betsy's story was relatable. She was a promising young woman with a bright future, a tragic figure whose life had been cut short. But as days turned into weeks and no suspect emerged, the coverage began to wane. The lack of updates from the police meant fewer headlines, and soon other stories took the spotlight. Compared to other unsolved murders of the era, such as the Zodiac killings or the case of the Black Dahlia, Betsy's story began to fade into the background. Those cases, while equally unsolved, had a certain mystique that kept the public's attention. They were marked by cryptic communications, multiple victims, or ongoing threats to public safety, which kept them in the news cycle for years. Betsy's murder, however, was a singular event with no follow up crimes or messages from the killer. The lack of new developments made it easier for the media and the public to move on. There was also the issue of geography. While Betsy's case was big news in Pennsylvania and among university circles, it didn't have the same national reach as crimes that occurred in major urban centers like Los Angeles or San Francisco. The media, especially in the late 1960s and early 1970s, was often driven by proximity, and crimes in smaller towns or rural areas were less likely to get ongoing national attention. Penn State, despite being a major university, was still located in a relatively isolated part of Pennsylvania, making it easier for the case to slip through the cracks as bigger stories took precedence. The media's dwindling interest in Betsy's case may have also had a direct impact on the investigation. In high profile cases, media pressure often pushes law enforcement agencies to devote more resources and keep the public informed, which in turn helps generate tips and leads. But as Betsy's case slipped out of the headlines, public pressure waned, and so did the flow of new information. Without constant media attention to keep the case in the public eye, it became increasingly difficult for investigators to gain new insights or tips from the community. In the end, the media's early focus on the murders slowly dissolved, and with it, the public's collective memory of Betsy Ardsma. The case became one of those haunting unsolved mysteries, a story that had captured attention for a moment but was ultimately forgotten by many outside of Penn State. And for investigators, the fading spotlight made it harder to keep the case alive, allowing it to drift into the long list of cold cases that never received the closure they deserved. Over 50 years have passed since Betsy Ardsma was killed in the stacks of the Patty Library, and despite the best efforts of investigators, her murder remains unsolved. The case has long since gone cold, leaving behind a trail of questions that may never be answered. But why has this case, which should have had numerous leads, remained such a mystery? Was it the mishandling of evidence, the passage of time, or something more elusive? One of the most obvious challenges in solving Betsy's case was the delayed recognition of the crime itself. In those crucial first moments after her collapse, the assumption that she had simply fainted or suffered a medical emergency meant that the crime scene wasn't immediately secured. By the time it became clear that she had been murdered, students, paramedics, and staff had already moved through the area, potentially contaminating crucial evidence. This early misstep made it difficult for investigators to gather clear forensic clues that could have pointed to the killer. The lack of witnesses also played a significant role in the case's cold status. Despite the fact that Betsy was murdered in a public place, no one saw the actual attack. The silence of the crime, the lack of a scream or struggle, made it nearly impossible to pinpoint exactly who was in the stacks with her at the time. The two men seen leaving the library shortly after her death were never identified, and no one else came forward with information that could directly tie them to the crime. Without solid witness testimony or forensic evidence, investigators were left with little to work with. Another factor is the absence of a clear motive. Was Betsy targeted for a specific reason, or was she simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? The lack of an obvious motive made it difficult for investigators to narrow down their suspect pool. Was it a personal vendetta, a random act of violence? Without understanding the why, it became nearly impossible to determine the who. Some have speculated that Betsy's murder could be considered a perfect crime, a rare instance where everything fell into place for the killer to escape unnoticed. The precision of the attack, the quick disappearance, and the lack of any physical evidence suggests that the person responsible may have known exactly what they were doing. But while the idea of a perfect crime is compelling, it's also terrifying. It suggests that there are some murders that, despite all the resources of modern investigation, may never be solved because the killer left no trace behind. Ultimately, the combination of a poorly secured crime scene, the lack of witnesses, and the passage of time have all contributed to the cold status of Betsy Ardsma's murder. As years passed, memories faded and potential leads disappeared. What might have been solved in the days and weeks after the crime slowly became a distant, unsolvable mystery. To understand who might have committed such a precise and cold blooded murder, investigators and criminal psychologists have long speculated about the psychological profile of Betsy Ardsma's killer. Was this a calculated act of violence carried out by someone with experience and control, or was it an impulsive, random murder fueled by a sudden burst of rage? The nature of the attack itself, one single, clean stab wound, implies a degree of calculation and intent. Criminal psychologists often point to the precision of the wound as a sign that the killer may have had some knowledge of anatomy or medical training. The fact that the killer struck directly at Betsy's heart, killing her within minutes, suggests that this was not a crime of opportunity but one of premeditation. The killer knew exactly where to strike to ensure a fatal blow, and they did so without hesitation. This level of control is indicative of someone who is not acting in the heat of the moment, but rather someone who had planned their actions carefully. Some psychologists have speculated that the killer may have exhibited traits of psychopathy, a personality disorder characterized by a lack of empathy, a disregard for the consequences of their actions, and a tendency toward calculated, cold behavior. The silent nature of the attack, the absence of any signs of struggle, and the killer's ability to disappear without a trace all point to a person who is highly methodical and detached from the emotional impact of their actions. Psychopaths are often able to blend into society, appearing normal to those around them while hiding a darker, more violent side. Another possibility is that the killer may have been driven by a personal grudge or obsession with Betsy, but the calculated nature of the crime suggests that this was not a crime of passion in the traditional sense. There was no excessive violence, no sign of overkill, which would typically be seen in a crime motivated by intense personal emotions. Instead, the killer acted with a level of detachment that is more characteristic of someone who views their victim not as a person but as a target. Of course, there's also the theory that the murder was entirely random, committed by someone who had no personal connection to Betsy but saw an opportunity to strike. In this case, the psychological profile of the killer would lean more toward someone who is impulsive but still capable of carrying out a crime with remarkable precision. This could be someone with a history of violent behavior, perhaps someone who had killed before, or someone who fantasized about murder and was waiting for the right moment to act. Ultimately, the psychological profile of Betsy's killer remains as much of a mystery as the crime itself. Whether it was a calculated, premeditated act by someone with anatomical knowledge or a random murder carried out by a deranged individual, the killer's ability to remain hidden for over 50 years suggests that they were skilled at covering their tracks. And without a clear profile, investigators have been left chasing shadows, trying to piece together the mind behind one of Penn State's most haunting unsolved crimes. In the years since Betsy Ardsma's murder, countless efforts have been made to keep the case alive, despite it growing cold soon after the initial investigation. One of the biggest challenges in unsolved cases like Betsy's is ensuring that her story isn't forgotten, and over the decades, various attempts have been made to revisit the case, each with the hope of finding the elusive answer that could finally bring closure. Law enforcement never officially closed the case, and though it hasn't always been an active investigation, it has remained on the radar of both local authorities and cold case units. In the 1980s and 1990s, investigators reviewed the case files, hoping that time and new perspectives could yield fresh insights. However, without new evidence or witnesses coming forward, those efforts failed to move the investigation forward in any meaningful way. More recently, advancements in forensic science, particularly DNA testing, have renewed hope that Betsy's murder might one day be solved. DNA testing has proven to be a game changer in solving cold cases, even decades after the fact, by identifying genetic material left at crime scenes. In cases like the Golden State Killer, it was the re examination of old evidence using modern DNA technology that finally led to an arrest. There is hope that Betsy's case could see similar progress if any physical evidence from the original investigation, such as clothing or materials from the library, could be retested for traces of DNA. However, the problem in Betsy's case lies in the fact that very little forensic evidence was collected at the time. The crime scene was disturbed before it was recognized as a murder, and any potential DNA samples could have been compromised by the high volume of people who unknowingly passed through the stacks in the aftermath of the crime. Despite these challenges, there remains a sense of optimism among those familiar with the case. DNA technology continues to evolve, and even the smallest trace of genetic material could one day lead investigators to Betsy's killer. Additionally, the case has gained renewed interest in recent years thanks to true crime media, which has helped bring attention back to cold cases around the world. Podcasts, documentaries, and online communities have played a significant role in generating public interest in unsolved mysteries. In Betsy's case, new generations of amateur sleuths have taken up her cause, hoping that modern tools, crowdsourcing, and fresh eyes might succeed where earlier efforts failed. Though no major breakthroughs have been made yet, the Ardsma family and those who knew Betsy hold on to the hope that one day technology will deliver the answers they've waited over 50 years for. Over the years, many investigators have worked on the Artsma case, each bringing their own perspective and approach to the unsolved murder. Some have since retired, while others continue to reflect on what might have been done differently to bring closure to Betsy's family. While many remain tight lipped about the specifics, there are moments of candid reflection that offer a glimpse into their thoughts and regrets. One of the recurring themes from interviews with those who worked on the case is the acknowledgement that the initial response was flawed. "We didn't know it was a homicide at first," one investigator who worked on the case in the early days said in an interview. "That delayed everything. By the time we secured the crime scene, key evidence had already been lost. That's something that has haunted us ever since." Another regret, voiced by both law enforcement officials and members of the Ardsma family, is that no solid witness accounts were ever obtained. "We had students coming and going, and in a university setting, there's a certain anonymity," another former detective shared. "There were people in the library, but no one saw the attack, and those two men who were seen leaving, they were never found. That's the part that sticks with me. Who were they? Why did they leave so quickly?" Detectives also expressed frustration with the limitations of forensic technology at the time. "We didn't have the tools we have today. DNA was just a concept back then. If we'd had what we have now, maybe we would have caught the killer," said one investigator, echoing the sentiment of many who have watched cold cases be solved in recent years through advances in forensic science. Despite the challenges and the passage of time, some of those involved in the case remain hopeful. "You never give up hope in a case like this," one retired officer said. "The fact that it's still unsolved means there's still a chance. Maybe someday someone will come forward or something will be uncovered that we missed. Until then, we keep Betsy's story alive." Betsy Ardsma's death has left a lasting mark on Penn State University, the community, and the many lives she touched in her brief 22 years. For her family, the pain of her loss is compounded by the lack of closure. To this day, they live with the unanswered question of who took their daughter, sister, and friend from them in such a brutal and senseless way. Her murder also altered the sense of safety on campus. Penn State had always been considered a secure, peaceful place and environment where students focused on their studies without fear. But after Betsy's death, that sense of security was shattered. The library, once a place of learning and refuge, became a reminder of the violence that had struck its quiet stacks. For many students, especially women, Betsy's murder was a reminder that nowhere was truly safe, even in broad daylight. Over the years, the university has held memorials for Betsy, ensuring that her name and her story are never forgotten. The lack of closure, however, still haunts the campus. Each time new students arrive at Penn State, they inevitably learn about the unsolved mystery of the library murder, and the story of Betsy Ardsma becomes woven into the fabric of campus history. For those who knew her, Betsy was more than just a victim of a terrible crime. She was a person full of promise and potential, someone whose life was tragically cut short just as she was beginning to shape her future. Betsy's legacy is one of resilience. Despite the lack of answers, her family and friends have continued to fight for justice, keeping her memory alive and hoping that one day they will know the truth. The impact of her murder on the community is a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the need to protect those spaces that are meant to foster growth and learning. As we look back on the murder of Betsy Ardsma, one question remains: will this case ever be solved? With the passage of over 5 decades, it's easy to feel as though the truth is slipping further and further away. But if there's one thing that history has shown us, it's that cold cases can be cracked wide open even after many years have passed. The key to solving Betsy's murder likely lies in modern technology. DNA testing has revolutionized the way cold cases are approached, and though the crime scene was compromised, there remains a possibility that some small piece of physical evidence could still hold the answers investigators have been seeking. Additionally, advancements in criminal profiling and new investigative techniques continue to offer hope for the future. However, time is both an enemy and a potential ally in cases like this. Witnesses grow older, memories fade, and people pass away. But at the same time, those same witnesses, now free from the fear or constraints they may have faced in the past, could come forward with new information. It's possible that someone knows something they've never shared, or that a chance discovery could reignite the investigation. The murder of Betsy Ardsma is a tragic reminder of the fragility of life and the devastating impact of violence. As we reflect on her story, we must ask ourselves, will her killer ever be found? Or is this a mystery destined to remain unsolved forever, a case that resists the light of truth no matter how closely we examine it? Only time will tell. But one thing is certain: Betsy Ardsma's memory and the search for justice will never be forgotten.